Welcome back, everybody. It's great to see a robust turnout again as we continue our seminar series. Today, I'm excited to welcome Professor Hannah Bloch Wehba. She's a law professor at Texas A&M. She's a leading scholar of law and technology. She's long been writing about how tech reshapes public governance. Recently, she's been thinking a lot about how tech can be a force that can be misused to conceal power and evade accountability. And that's very related to what many of us have worked on from our own disciplinary perspectives, and Professor Bloch Wehba brings her legal expertise, so I'm really excited that her year visiting us is going to be very generative and productive for many of us, and I hope you have a wonderful time as well. She is affiliated with Yale's Information Society Project, with NYU School of Law's Policing Project, as well as with the Center for Democracy and Technology. And most recently, she was at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is, of course, very close by. And we had this enticing opportunity to take advantage of her already being in the area to arrange a visiting position for a year, and I'm glad that we were able to overcome whatever bureaucratic hurdles were in the way. So I'm very excited, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm Hannah Bloch Wehba. I'm a legal scholar, and as Arvin said, a lot of my work has to do with the relationship between technology and public governance, and in particularly, I'm interested in the ways that technology firms and government agencies work together. How and why do they work together? What are the effects of these collaborations on rights, transparency, and accountability? And how are these relationships structured by law? How do they implicate legal values? So I'm really happy to be here to talk to you guys about this project, which is very much a work in progress. To put it mildly, tech's influence on the state has been on people's minds recently. Trump's election, Musk's role, Doge, and the broader alignment of Silicon Valley with the Trump administration have all spurred a seemingly newfound recognition of the tech industry's outsized influence in politics. But this transformation is anything but sudden. Tech firms have long wielded extensive influence over government actions and policy in numerous domains. And so today I want to talk to you about an article project that is very much in progress. The working title is How Tech Took Over, and it's an exploration of the way in which the information economy has reshaped the state. So these are the central questions that I'm asking in this project. I'm interested in better understanding the position that tech firms play in our legal and political order. And I'm interested in the legal building blocks, both historical and contemporary, that have enabled the industry to attain this position. So this is really a paper about what Biden in his farewell address described as the tech industrial complex. Okay, for a bunch of different reasons, I hate the term tech industrial complex, and yet I am going to use it anyway. I think it connotes a kind of conspiratorial thinking, like tweed, elbow patches, cigar smoke in the 1970s. I also don't think it even captures the problem here particularly well as a phrase. But I think the idea of the industrial complex, imperfect as it is, actually captures something really important about both the history of tech's power and its condition today. So this is not a paper that's primarily about tech products or models in the state. It's about the relationship between tech firms and the state. And so in a way, it's more about political economy. And my hope is to sort of advance the idea of the complex as a useful construct for thinking through the tech industry's power and its relationship with our legal and political order. So I'm going to start with the first question, and then I'm going to spend the second part of the talk on the second question. And I want to start by giving you some background about how legal scholars have thought about the relationship between tech and the state. So there's a stream of research in which scholars have really looked at the ways that the state enlists tech firms as partners in censorship efforts. We see this in a lot of the scholarship, for example, on content moderation, right? There's a second body of work about how tech companies became conduits of customer data to the government, how they became surveillance intermediaries in Alan Rosenstein's words. And there's a third area of scholarship that investigates how technology has remade the state itself. In the aughts, this is sort of an optimistic version of e-government scholarship. And today we see this kind of scholarship when we think about, public sector uses of algorithmic governance and AI, for example. I've written in all three of these areas. I think of this paper as cutting across them, but primarily I'm focused on the third area. So what are the elements of tech's entrenchment in the state? The first and most visible aspect involves Silicon Valley's increasing enmeshment with the military itself. So the original idea of the industrial complex, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the second half of the talk, involved the relationship between military contractors, defense agencies, and academic institutions. For now, just suffice it to say that particularly as the Vietnam War became unpopular, the idea of the industrial complex became a shorthand for describing the enmeshment of profit-seeking companies charged with developing technology and the military itself. And the complex sort of connoted an untoward degree of influence, both that the government had over these private sector actors and that those actors had over policy itself, particularly foreign policy. Okay, in a similar way, the contemporary relationship between the government and Silicon Valley both enriches a booming private industry and enlists that industry as a vital partner with substantial influence over policy. So we're seeing particularly visible cooperation between Silicon Valley and the military, and partly this is the result of a decision over a decade ago that the military ought to focus more on procuring commercially available technology rather than contracting for bespoke projects. And that was a decision that drove a sort of investment in innovation that drove contracts increasingly toward technology companies rather than legacy military contractors. Now, this isn't zero sum. Obviously, the tech industrial complex doesn't completely displace the military industrial complex, but I think in important ways, we are seeing a transformation afoot. And partly this is because of cloud and AI contracting, which have both yielded enormous contracts that flow to big tech companies, including Amazon, Google, Oracle, and others. But you wouldn't call this a complex if all that was happening was influence flowing in the form of government contracts from the state to the industry. Instead, part of the argument here is that influence is also flowing from the industry back into policy. And part of maybe the most significant way in which the tech industry stands poised to influence policy is the arms race against China that pops up everywhere in AI policy discourse. This arms race framing justifies massive infusions of government spending, as well as anti-regulatory initiatives designed to speed up innovation. As with the nuclear arms race, the AI arms race argument benefits the industry that's poised to develop the nation's capabilities and ensure that the United States wins the arms race, whatever that might actually mean. So this example underscores the relationship between American technology dominance, domestic policy, and geopolitics. And it's become very visible in the news and in public discourse around the relationship with tech, between tech and the state. I can pause here for questions if anyone has any, or else I can just keep on going.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Your stance is relatively neutral, or at least your words appear neutral on this topic, and yet you also have this complex definition which implies maybe a negative undertone that you think that maybe this shouldn't be happening. Could you speak more on your position, like what you think?
I think it's bad.
Why?
Well, I think I'm getting there, but I think that a lot of the concerns that we've had about unelected actors wielding influence over policy, about money driving political choices, and about apparently neutral technological tools being used to mask policy decisions are surfacing here. And they're implicit, but they haven't been made explicit. And so I see part of the project as making those assumptions explicit. I think you're right that the complex term itself has a sort of significance, right? It suggests a negative undertone. Nobody talks about the military industrial complex and like collapse. But honestly, it's one of the reasons I think it's an imperfect term, and I'm using it in spite of that, although I haven't decided whether it stays in the paper. So I appreciate you surfacing the normative question. Yeah.
Quick clarification question. It seems like you're mainly talking about US law and policy and like tech taking over that scope, but maybe you'll get to it also, like if you're envisioning this being like specific to the US or like global policy or, North American,
Yeah.
English speaking.
So I am an American lawyer. I work on areas related to American constitutional law. So I'm in this paper primarily concerned with US institutions. Totally fair question. Yeah.
Just a quick clarificatory question which connects with the one over there. So I do come from the nuclear security space. I work program on science and global security. So MIC, military industrial complex, very nice term that we like. So are you also problematizing that one, and that informs according to your position here with the TIC, or?
Am I problematizing the idea of the MIC in addition to the TIC? Not really. I'm sort of just trying to make an argument that the TIC is, and I'm gonna get to this in a minute, in some ways an advancement of the traditional MIC and in other ways a departure. Yeah.
This might be too much of an empiricist question, but while we all have exposure through the media to this idea that tech is pushing the arms race framing in exchange for investment and deregulation, are there any methods you know of looking behind the scenes and teasing out those causal arrows to what extent it's happening and how effective it is?
I haven't done this work, but I think the lobbying question is significant here, right? Lobbying expenditures. I would be very interested to see, once that data is out there, especially on the AI moratorium that was introduced as part of the big, beautiful bill and killed at the last minute, to see how the lobbying money sort of flows. Okay. So in some ways, the tech industrial complex is a direct extension of an earlier military industrial complex. A key difference is that today tech firms are also increasingly responsible for providing informational infrastructure to the state across the board, not limited to military agencies. Infrastructures are systems that support other forms of activity. The design and configuration of infrastructures can be invisible but highly significant. They can facilitate or impede agencies' work. In an era in which we've come to expect information on demand in real time, informational infrastructure is the way that we realize those expectations. It enables access, and it provides a platform for government decision-making. So for many legal scholars, the most concerning aspects of tech's role in informational infrastructure relate to concerns about decision-making and fundamental fairness. So for example, when the government uses AI or algorithmic tools to make decisions about benefits or punishment or employment, we worry about the fairness of those decisions. We worry about what might be a concealed sort of private or technologically mediated role in making those decisions. And we worry about the fit between that kind of decision making and, for example, due process, right? How do you ensure fundamental fairness in a world of technologically mediated government decision making? I think those are all fair concerns, but informational infrastructure also has important ramifications beyond questions about individual impacts on rights. Consider, for example, the implications for privacy law. Cloud providers for the government promise efficient and seamless data sharing. Now, obviously that's profoundly appealing, but it can also shift important decisions about flows of information within government itself to private contractors. And that can also be used to subvert decisions about transparency, secrecy, access to information, and individual privacy, as when cloud providers provide access to data systems that were once siloed and all of a sudden united. A final component of the tech industrial complex is about data itself. You know, tech firms harvesting of massive quantities of data have really reshaped the way that we think about what the government can and should accomplish. Private actors can collect data without constitutional limits. In fact, private actors sometimes exploit constitutional protections precisely to collect data and then sell it back to the government. Private actors can draw inferences between sets of data that the government cannot because of privacy law. And private actors can operate without scrutiny. They're not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Unlike government actors who have to publish their data gathering activities in the Federal Register under the Privacy Act, there's no comparable corporate transparency law. So precisely because the law and Constitution permit the industry to do things that the government cannot, the imperative to collect and analyze data encourages ever greater reliance by the government on private actors. And so it drives sort of private market in data for which the government is the primary, sometimes even the exclusive customer, but which is encased from constitutional accountability. Okay, so far I've given you a sort of sketchy description of the contemporary role of the tech industry in public governance. The second part of the talk is about how we got here. Before I move on to that second part, I want to pause again to see if you want to ask me more questions about the industrial complex. Yeah.
I guess I was curious how you complicate this story with things like the US government taking like 10% ownership of companies like Intel.
Yeah.
And I could imagine something like that could happen with another company that is specifically in the AI space. And I don't know, like, what do you think about that in this context?
Yeah, I mean, so the question about US ownership, like state capitalism question, I think is really important because it's a question about sort of relationship between industrial policy, state capitalism, and where we have traditionally seen the boundaries between the private and the state, the market and the state. But it's not limited to tech, and so I haven't put it in the paper, right? Like we see it with steel companies too. And so I think that while the reason that it feels germane to the project is because tech is so substantial a driver of US economic interests and geopolitical interests that naturally it appears to be the case that like we want that golden share in the tech companies, right? But because it's not unique to tech and seems like it's more a emerging feature of our shifting industrial policy, if we want to call it that, I haven't included it here. Yeah.
Have you also considered the way in which the disintegration of Silicon Valley companies and the state affects competition? So for example, TikTok is the golden example where it's questionable what the actual concerns are versus how much of a competitive issue it is for these enmeshed service providers.
Well, TikTok is a really messy example, right? Because it seems clear that the enmeshed service providers wanted TikTok out, got it through legislation and Supreme Court decision, and then didn't get it in the end. And why that happened is a complicated story that seems to be in some ways a counterexample to the story I'm telling about US tech influence, right? If they had as much influence as we might suggest, maybe TikTok would be gone already, and it's not. But I do think it's an interesting, the competition question is really important, and I get into it a little bit in the context of government contracting for software, where the practices of government procurement of software really have enabled big incumbents to lock in on a permanent basis their advantages. And I'm arguing that one feature of that is because there's so much access to data, sensitive government data, and because the role that they're playing is infrastructural rather than simply ordinary provision of goods and services, it creates different kinds of competitive issues that we haven't traditionally seen as part of sort of antitrust toolkit.
Sort of two questions. First is on the antitrust point. Do you think that independent regulators like the FTC, the FCC, are in any way able to act as sort of a counterweight to this? Are they able to act outside of this sort of, as you call it, the technology industrial complex, or are they wrapped up in this and are they unable to actually work independently? And then also, how do you think this differs from the technology developments that we saw during the Cold War, where it was technology companies doing very similar things, while yes, with the military purpose, also with substantial telecom things like AT&T and whatnot?
Yeah. So, on the first, I am not in an optimistic mood about the power of independent regulatory agencies. I don't know if we're gonna have them for like another year, another month, like, I don't know, but it's not a good time for independent regulatory agencies to be going against the tide, right? So no, I would say the political reality, like the legal question is one thing, but the political reality is another. The question about, so I think what is really different from the earlier part of the Cold War is the turn to commercialization, which happens in the 80s and is driven by patent and entrepreneurship policy, means that yes, it's always been true that certain companies are both working with the government and serving, ordinary customers. But part of what's happening here is that it's the companies that have gotten their start by serving ordinary customers that are now turning around to work with the government in ways that may undermine, if they had been going on from the start, have undermined their claims to be working for the public first, and I think that is interesting and noteworthy. Yeah.
I guess I'm curious to hear your perspective on like the government responding to this. I feel like the government has developed ways to mitigate this. For example, non-traditional procurement pathways like competitions, small business specialized contract paths, minority focused contract pathing, short turnaround contract pathing. And I know that there are active mechanisms in play to prevent vendor lock-in and that it is now a requirement considered upfront.
Yeah.
So is this still a problem in light of that?
Vendor lock in particular?
Vendor lock perhaps. but also these non-traditional procurement pathways that have evolved over the past couple of years?
You know, some of the non-traditional procurement pathways are significant in some contexts and not others, right? When we're talking about like large-scale cloud contracting, I don't think they're doing a ton of work. So software contracting is a total mess, and in part it's been because of the role of resellers, which is now also changing because of federal like instructions to essentially eliminate the resellers as intermediaries. All of this is in flux. The bigger picture political economic problems with entrenched reliance on tech companies and their influence over policy are intact. And I don't think any amount of tinkering around the edges with procurement policy is gonna change them without bigger legal and political economic changes. Felix?
Yeah, curious about how you're thinking. So it seems that the project right now has like a more national focus. Curious how you're thinking about like different levels of the state, for example, like municipal level. I think your comment about private actors supplying some of that data collection capacity, I think seems super salient at a city level.
Yeah.
Where they might not have that infrastructure.
Yeah, at the municipal level, I think the problems are different in some ways, more pronounced, and in some ways less pronounced. So at the municipal level, for example, I think about, I can't now come up with the name of the company that provides the infrastructure. Granicus is a company that provides the infrastructure for almost every city's city council record keeping. And it's a for-profit company, and cities enter into this contract to basically host all the documents and provide public awareness of, city council meetings and hearings, et cetera. It's a real capture issue, waiting to be surfaced, both because there are no real competitors, and because when you have a private intermediary that controls the flow of information that's necessary for the public to engage in the democratic process, we start to wonder about the role of that intermediary in, for example, asserting trade secrecy over documents or data, et cetera. So this has come up in the municipal context, also with like surveillance technology and comparable examples. It's not in the paper because, well, I think the paper might wind up being a book, but it's not a book yet, it's just a paper, and so it can't do everything, but I am thinking about it.
Thanks.
All right, so I wanna turn to the second set of questions, which is about the origins of the complex. So I've sort of sketched the present condition, I would say. And I meant to say this is not encyclopedic. I don't mean to say this is the only story you can tell about the role of tech in the state. This is just one of many stories we could tell. It's just one that I don't think has been told yet, and I think is increasingly important and salient to people as we think about how to conceive of the political and legal order that we inhabit, right? So the second question is how we got here, essentially. And it traces the commitments that have encouraged text infusion into the state. And so I'm arguing that the complex is the product of three distinct but related politico-legal commitments, right? One is to data processing as a form, an instrument of domestic governance. The second is technology as an instrument of geopolitical dominance and national security. And the third is reliance on the private sector by way of government contracting as a sort of linchpin of how the government does business. So I may not have time to talk about all three of these, and if we run out of time, I'm gonna talk about the first two, and if we have extra time, I'll talk about the third as well. So the first commitment, data processing as a modality of governance, is entailed by the shift that occurs in the early 20th century toward an expanding role for the federal government. And that's what we, colloquially know as the New Deal. I don't think it's confined to the New Deal defined as such, but in essence, in order to grow the state and equip it to make decisions that we increasingly expect it to make, it needs to be able to process data. So it's kind of helpful to look back to an early example, the decennial census starting in the late 19th century changed because of the development of punch card tabulation. And without the punch card, it took the census workers almost the full decade to actually generate the results of the census before. And so by the time they had done it, then they were starting on the new one and it made no sense and was terrible. Right? Magic punch card arrives and it transforms everything. All of a sudden we can tabulate and analyze huge quantities of data. And that's great because now we can ask literally 13,000 questions on the decennial census and generate answers within a couple of years. And the tabulating machine company that develops those punch card tabulators is founded in 1896, later becomes IBM. Right, so punch card tabulation meaningfully transforms the government's analytic capabilities because without it, the government could not analyze robust statistical data with any degree of sort of rapid turnaround. And once they have the ability to do that, they can grow the state in ways that permit it to expand the provision of services and benefits to huge numbers of people all at the same time. So this is a picture from 1960 of tabulators at the Social Security Administration. The Social Security Administration is the first sort of born tabulated agency, right? It started off using punch card tabulation in order to analyze the data necessary for wage and tax reporting. If you can't do wage and tax reporting, you can't have the Social Security system as we know it. So it starts off as a sort of tabulation shop and continues in that way. And it bought its machines from IBM. And IBM's role in providing the punch card tabulators for the Social Security Administration gave it a leg up in government contracting for 50 years, right? I'm not saying this is an example of anti-competitive vendor lock. I'm saying this is an example of the way in which the private role facilitating government data analysis becomes enmeshed in what we think the government ought to be doing, what our expectations of the state actually are, become contingent on the technology that's available to the state. The second example, tech as a mechanism to achieve geopolitical dominance. Here is where we get back to the traditional military-industrial complex. Post-war and Cold War science policy recognized that the federal government ought to have a really active role in incentivizing and supporting the development of science and technology. And in particular, the Cold War science policy sort of apparatus identified the nation's technological dominance as a critical national security objective, particularly after the Sputnik launch in 1957. And this posture famously not only fueled investment in basic research, basic scientific research, particularly physics, but it also underpinned the stockpiling of nuclear weapons and the arms race. And so science policy is partly to blame for what President Eisenhower in his famous departure speech called the military-industrial complex. Now, over the course of his career in both military and government more generally, Eisenhower had participated directly in the creation and expansion of science policy and overseen the growth of the defense industry. So while he leaves office as a critic of the complex, he was also in some ways a creator of the complex. But what the complex does is put primacy on science and technology as the key mechanisms through which the United States is going to, secure economic progress and secure its position suddenly at the top of an international world order after World War II. And so that primacy on science and technology as drivers of security and progress facilitate the infusion of huge amounts of funding. Commercialization comes later. Prior to 1980, the focus is really on technological development without that much attention to commercialization. But it's an enormous influx of funding, famously gave rise to Silicon Valley as well as the defense industry. And so I don't think we can tell the story about how we got here without understanding that science and technology sit at the very core of what we understood to make America dominant during the 20th century. All right, I'm gonna pause again, and then if you guys give me time, I'll talk to you about the contract state, and if not, yes.
Talking about investments in science and technology and the Eisenhower's farewell address, it brings up the question of the relationship in academia with both of these
Yeah,
other entities, government and big tech, or just big industrial science and technology companies. I wonder if you could elaborate on your thoughts more with regard to how academia fits into this picture, particularly with respect to the assault on academia that we're seeing.
yeah. So, keeping in mind that this talk is gonna be posted on YouTube, I think that what we're seeing now is in many ways a radical departure from the order that we traditionally thought of as the military-industrial complex. And the reason is precisely because we are seeing this sort of clamp down on funding to academia in favor of a sort of implicit assumption that technological dominance is going to be driven primarily not by basic research, but by applied research, not by academic labs, but by industrial labs. That is the inversion of some of the core assumptions that gave rise to the post-war science policy order. Whether it sticks, is anybody's guess. I will say it's not the first time we've seen a real political backlash against government funding of academic science. This happened during the Vietnam War in particular with the Mansfield Amendment, which really radically curtailed government funding for military activities that was flowing to universities. The difference is that that was really because of a sort of hostility to the Vietnam War, which was also felt within the universities themselves. And now I think the case feels very sort of different. What's driving a crackdown is not worry that the universities, in some way, it is a worry that the universities are abetting a federal policy that we disagree with. I think it's coming from a very different political direction, obviously. Yeah.
In the story that you're telling, how do you position something like the US digital service that the Obama administration created as a way to bring experts from the tech companies into the government to help with things? Do you see that as part of a larger arc in history, or was that like a...
Well, the US digital service does become Doge, so
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. Yeah.
Yes, I do think it's part of a larger arc, and in some ways, what I'm trying to trace here is how our ideas about how we could embed technology in a liberal order are being sort of mutated into ideas about how to embed it in an illiberal order. And it doesn't actually take that huge of a shift in order to accomplish that. It's part of the argument that I'm trying to make here. You know, looking back, my criticisms of USDS feel really quaint. You know, it could have been better, but what we've got now is not great. So, and I will own that, but I think the assumptions about bringing tech expertise into the state and the role, like the beneficent role that tech companies could play in supporting the state, have really been undermined by the speed with which we've seen the same actors and companies start to undercut the capacity of the state. And I think that that should prompt us to ask some really hard questions about what their role ought to be if we ever come out of this. Yeah.
I'm wondering how similar you think the MIC and TIC are in like either the services they provide or the capabilities they enable. Meaning, I think the military-industrial complex facilitates military capabilities which normal private citizens like don't have access to, only the government does.
Yep.
But with technology, these are capabilities that we have access to. For example, with Social Security Administration, we can think calculators or computers. These are things that, it's abilities that the government, we expect them to have, but like, maybe I don't expect government to have like a nationalized computer manufacturer. And maybe cars or like food supply chain are like good comparable examples of like, is this similar to the MIC or is this just another like external reliance that the government has on technology? Or maybe I'm like misunderstanding what technology really is here.
So I think you're right, and in some ways, right, like when the tech providers perform services for the military that enable, you know, AI, computer vision for drone targeting, et cetera, we would think, okay, this is in some ways an extension of consumer technology, and in other ways really a departure. Like you and I do not luckily have access to this technology, and we shouldn't. And then of course, I think there are expectations we have about what the state should do that have been driven by the widespread adoption of consumer technology. And so my favorite example, I put this in the paper, is the FBI after 9/11 was deep in a software, like an infrastructure upgrade project, because even before 9/11, it couldn't search across field offices. And it took them 10 years to be able to finish this project and like 2 failed contracts, et cetera. And there's a hearing in which Chuck Schumer has the director of the FBI in Congress in 2002. And he's basically like, your system isn't as good as the Apple computer I just bought my 7th grader. Why don't you just hire one of those smart guys from Google to fix this for you? And the director is like, that's fair, essentially, right? Like the gap between government technology and consumer technology grew so fast is part of the reason for government's dependence on the private sector and its lack of in-house ability to sort of close that gap is also partly responsible for the sector's sort of being able to drive decision-making in a way that accrues to its own advantage, if that makes sense. So I think that there's an element of like something really important in the fact that all of this is stuff that's available to ordinary people. Not all of it though, right? Like some of it is quite rarefied, and to the degree we have come to expect the government to pay huge sums of money to get what ordinary people expect we have access to rather cheaply, I think it also reinforces a narrative about how ill-equipped the state is to solve problems and how comparably advanced the private sector is. Yeah,
Sorry.
that's okay.
But isn't that like not the government's fault, but the result of predating policy, like from the Reagan era, like the 80-20 kind of, you can only have 20% going to in-house people.
Yeah,
80%
okay, so maybe
contract.
now's a good time to talk about the contract state, if I can get my slides to show the. Yes, but part of the argument I'm making here is that it's not just, the result of neoliberalism, right? It's not just the result of neoliberal commitments to privatization and outsourcing. It's also, and I agree, it's not the government's fault necessarily. It's the reflection of a political order that we inhabit that conceives of the government as ill-equipped to solve social problems and the private sector as relatively well-equipped. And what that political order conceals is, rather not conceals, but surfaces a set of assumptions about the relative capacity of different kinds of institutions, right? I agree this is not because the government is actually bad and the sector is actually good. My interest is in how these ideas about the domains of the market and the state are influencing the distribution of power among these institutions and the relationships between them. Okay. I have to unhide the slide. Go back. All right. So the third pillar is there, I think, are maybe 4 pillars. Like I said, this is a work in progress. This isn't even the whole paper, guys. But a third pillar in the tech industrial complex that I think is really important is government contracting, which enabled the state to expand its reach and range, but also fulfilled its commitments to support free enterprise, right? And so we make a decision. I use the word we advisedly. I wasn't there at the New Deal. But at that moment that we create the New Deal order, it rests on these agreements with private institutions, academic institutions, private companies, that we should realize our sort of return on these investments in science and technology through private provision rather than public provision. So weapons, scientific research, technological development, none of them are the direct responsibility of the state. They are all the responsibility of the state's contracting partners, right? And part of the reason that we do that is because of a long-standing belief that the federal government, as it's expanding during the New Deal, actually should be quite small. And so there's this tension between New Deal advocates who support the expansion of the state and its detractors who think actually the federal government constitutionally is limited to these incredibly confined roles and it ought to be small. How do we negotiate that difference? By creating a political arrangement in which the government gets to steer these private actors but not grow the state so radically that it becomes unrecognizable. So for example, contract state, which is what Harold Nieberg called it in a 1955 article, allows the government to expend all these resources without hiring additional personnel, right? And it allows it to fulfill all these promises without actually becoming too much bigger. Now you might say, too much for whom? And that would be a fair question, because even with this sort of compromise, the state still becomes too big for some and not big enough for others. The thing that happens that I find is really under discussed in the legal scholarship is that the part of the sort of formative influence of the industrial complex is a rule that becomes adopted in 1955 that the government ought not to compete with the private sector. Anything the private sector can provide, the government should get from outside rather than creating in-house. Why? Because if the government uses its advantages and its size to create things in-house and compete with the private sector, then that just reeks of socialism. And in 1955, obviously, that was sort of a death sentence for any political activity. And that expectation that the government ought not to compete with the private sector, but should rely on the private sector, is embedded in federal procurement law from the very beginning. And so the systemic reliance on outside actors that I'm describing here is not a new thing. It is an artifact of this settlement that we entered into in the 40s and 50s, that we ought to limit the size of the government by using the government contract as a vehicle to vindicate our goals without growing the state too big. Okay, so now I will actually stop and welcome your other questions in the last 10 minutes. Yeah.
Just following up on that, do you think we'll see a change in that regulation, just given how much reliance, okay, so it will still be that government should rely on private sector, but now, wouldn't that just escalate this industrial complex situation?
Yes, like I said, this is not a talk that's coming from a place of optimism.
But do you foresee any sort of infrastructure to like counter that? Because this seems like a big issue.
Yeah, no, I agree, it's a big issue. Sorry. It's one of many very big issues. I mean, yeah, so no, not only do I not see this changing from a regulatory perspective, repeatedly over decades and decades, Congress has introduced this as an actual statute and it's never been enacted, which I find very interesting. So the rule appears in different kinds of settings. It appears in federal procurement law. It appears in a memo that guides the procurement of outside services and goods. It appears in the federal like highway procurement statute, which is more important than you might expect. And then repeatedly, we've seen Congress try to enact a blanket ban government competition with private enterprise law. They've never succeeded. But if I were to bet, that would be more in the direction we appear to be going than like public interest minded, sort of grow the state to do good things, liberal, blah, blah. Arvin?
Just a quick clarifying question on that
Yeah.
point. So who's making the rule in the absence of congressional action? Is it OMB or?
So the federal procurement rules are, they are like in the federal acquisition regulation, and they're made by, is it OMB? Yeah, it's OMB. I'm looking at you because you clearly know a lot about procurement law. They're made by OMB. The military has its own procurement regulations which run parallel to the FAR. They're updated frequently, and they are, this is a sort of side note, but extremely long in detail. And so they're kind of like, they're really important and nobody understands them. Yeah.
Sort of two questions, one on the not very optimistic front. Is there a solution to this that doesn't involve entirely tearing down the system, in your opinion? In terms of like, could we do this without like basically going back to the New Deal and shifting New Deal era policy, which I think has largely driven where we are infrastructurally in the US? And also your take on open source and all of this, that's just like a side point.
Aren't we tearing down the system? Like, aren't we watching the system get torn down around us?
Sure.
It's already been torn down.
So in that sense, like, but I guess, is it being rebuilt back in a way that would be even harder to tear down in the future?
I think, so when I started writing this article, I was thinking about things that I didn't believe required wholesale, massive changes to our political system, and now it feels clear to me that we're not gonna get these kinds of changes without those bigger political transformations. I'm sorry to dodge, but like, we're not going back to the New Deal order. So I think where I'm what I'm trying to do with the paper is articulate a cautionary note about the degree to which whatever political order comes next relies on the tech sector to provide infrastructure, services, and rests on the beneficence of that sector. I think we have now learned that that's not wise. Open source. I don't have any like strong feelings about open source.
Thank you.
I guess I have a question about more of a way to think more optimistic about this space. So I wonder if the way you're thinking about the tech industrial complex is this tech corporate group that is very homogeneous perhaps, or monolith, but the reality is like even the people you post on that photo, it's not like they're super friendly to each other in a business perspective, right? So they compete with each other and so on. And then even within that, there is the group of people who are the current oligarchs, and then there is the kind of people who are trying to fund startups that supplant them, kind of like the VC kind of the world. And so all of them are not as monolith as maybe the tech industrial complex seems to present them. So I wonder if a source of optimism would be to think about the potential fracture within that tech industrial complex.
I do really look forward to the feuds and internal fighting and self-destruction if that ever happens. But I worry about the fracturing you're describing because in part, I think a year or two ago, I would have said, there are big differences. The way that even the big tech CEOs behave are not all in alignment, and the political decision-making like that they are making is sort of, they're not acting in concert. And now I don't see as much divergence as I did, or as much capacity to withstand political pressure as I might have a year or two ago. And so I worry that the small companies that are trying to displace them are not gonna be any better, and in some ways they're gonna be worse, right? That if they're trying to, exist in a economic and political space where to enter is to curry political favor, I don't expect great things out of that. But I could get, I'm trying to keep an open mind and not like drown in a pool of my own despair here, but it's kind of hard. Yeah.
Sorry, so you had a previous slide where you talked about private enterprises like a data progenitor and this kind of interface between the public sector and the private sector and some constitutional protections around data collection, extending to the government, but not covering private enterprise. Could you dig in a little bit more and explain kind of what you see as like the mechanism of the problem? Is it that private enterprise can collect all of this private data and then they get access to government data when they're working on contracts, and then that kind of provides this like network effect that allows them to lock in as a vendor? And also I'm not familiar with the law, but do those public protections against data collection not extend to the private sector, especially when working on a government contract?
Okay, so no, they don't. It's a good question. Part of the problem, I think, is just that the differential treatment of private and government actors under the Constitution means that the government does less and it expects the private sector to do more and still benefits from what the private sector does. So for example, we don't exactly know what the limits of government purchases of data are constitutionally. We know that there are certain things that the government simply cannot collect without a warrant. The private sector collects them. The question is, can the government then go and buy them without a warrant? And the answer is sort of, we don't know. And so the government both the government and the private sector are taking advantage of that uncertainty and the fact that there is a gap between what the two can do to enable forms of data collection that evade constitutional accountability.
So you would, if you had unlimited power as a regulator, you would try to create parity there to eliminate this perverse incentive structure that you seem to be
Regulators can't do anything about this because it's an artifact of constitutional law. If I were Justice Bloch Wehba, right? Like, I think that this is going to come before the court in a few years, and what happens, I mean, we don't know, but like, the question is about the constitutional rules and the ability of constitutional rules to adapt to these sort of relationships. And so part of the argument I make in the paper that I didn't make here is about the need to update constitutional doctrine to accommodate these relationships in ways that we just have not seen it evolve so far. I think we're at time, but I'll talk to you after.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you all.